long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is constant reader Scott Daly, and this is my kind limo driver who's extremely worried about those times I go missing for days at a time, Matt Freeman.
Oh, I wouldn't say anything about it, though. Don't want to pry.
I'm so glad you did an Irish accent on that, because I don't listen to the audiobooks, except I was hanging out today with not as much to do as normal, and I was like, I'm at a podcast to listen to. I'll listen to some of the audiobook. and I saw that they did an Irish accent for Andrew, and I was like, yes. If we read anything he says, we have to do that in Irish accent, and then you did it. So there we go.
Yeah, well, that wasn't planned,
This week on the show, we begin part 2 of the Drawing of the Three, entitled The Lady of Shadows. We'll be discussing the first 3 chapters of part 2. This gets a little confusing, but there it is. So in this section, we meet the Lady of Shadows, who happens to be 2 people, Odetta Holmes and Detta Walker, 2 wheelchair-bound individuals living in the same body ever since a brick struck a childhood Odetta on the head. Odetta and Detta aren't aware of each other, but Roland and Eddie are, as they yank the lady into Roland's world, drawing the second of the 3. Eddie immediately falls in love with Odetta, even as Roland warns him that there's another woman inside there, and she's nothing but trouble. All right, Matt, what did you think about this week's reading?
Yeah, I mean, it continues to be wild and unpredictable, right? I think that's, I don't know what else to do other than to keep remarking that every week, like, the inventiveness and twisty turniness and surprising creativity of the book just continues to go on as a theme, and just kind of constantly elevating my appreciation for what Stephen King is doing here.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is so cool is, even if after the Eddie set of chapters, you might have had an idea, like, if you look at all the hints through the Oracle and through the Man in Black, like, the idea that this woman was going to be in a wheelchair is pretty evident there. I think you guessed that. I think you were right on with that. There's multiple instances of, like, her having 2 sides of her personality, that she's 2 people. So you even could have gone far enough to guess that there's some multiple personality thing, or dissociative identity disorder, rather, going on here. But even if you had guessed those things, where this book actually takes it is so shocking and pleasantly surprising, and I don't know, it's just fun. Like, it's been a while since I read this book, and I'm just having fun, man. It's so much fun.
Right. I think I have some notes later on the topic of just, like, how just fun the book is. Like there's so many books that, I mean, we read so many books for book club and so forth, and a lot of them, like, you're ultimately glad you read them, but they can be, like, kind of like, oh, this is painful. Like, most like this whole series has been just a fun ride so far. I mean, there've been some pretty dark moments, like letting the child die. But like, it's always keeping you entertained, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're just getting started too. I love experiencing this with you, and, like, you ain't seen nothing yet, man. So
great,
so exciting. All right, well, let's just jump into it and get into the chapter discussion. So we begin on part 2, The Lady of Shadows, chapter 1, titled fittingly, Detta and Odetta. And before we get into the chapter as a whole, I wanted to take a step back here and wanted to talk about these characters, Odetta and Detta, talk about Stephen King, and talk about the ways in which he writes women and people of color. And if I'm being entirely honest, I remember this part of this book, and this was the thing I was the most nervous to cover in this level of detail in 2020. As we said back in The Gunslinger, King has had some issues with writing women in the past. He's had some issues with writing black characters in the past. And we take those 2 things, combine them, and then add on top a case of misdiagnosed schizophrenia. They call it schizophrenia. It's actually dissociative identity disorder. But we add that to the mix, and we have this recipe for a character that is, like, capital P problematic, as the children say. But you know what? From my perspective, even in 2020, I was really pleasantly surprised here. I still love these characters. I love Odetta and Detta. I think they're so fascinating. And I'm not saying there aren't going to be moments later in the story where I'm not going to be like, yikes, or like shake my head at the 1980s of it all. But I still found myself instantly in love with these characters in a similar way to Eddie is. And I was was surprised. It was like a load off my shoulders. I was pretty nervous going into this section, and I feel less nervous now.
Yeah, I feel like Odetta is a great lovable character.
Yeah.
And I mean Detta is a monster.
Yeah, right.
But like that's just what she is.
Right. Well, I mean, one of my big concerns was the very stereotypical, like, this is how black people talk thing of Detta. And then I had forgotten, though, that the book almost specifically remarks on that itself, right? I think there's I think it's one of the ambulance or the intern that remarks that she speaks like a cartoon version of a black person. Like, it is meant to be caricature. Like, this is not Stephen King saying this is how black people talk. No, this is supposed to be like a caricature of what that would be. And I don't know. I think that gave me such a sigh of relief here. Like, and I'm not saying there's not elements of it that you might look at today and be like, but man, it's not too bad at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, I'm just reading this with this was the 80s. This is a book from the 80s glasses on. The 80s are closer to the 60s than they are to the present, you know? So if anything, I would have been surprised if even the most well-intentioned writer in the 1980s didn't strike some notes that seem false to the modern ear.
Sure.
I mean, it still strikes me that King's heart is basically in the right place. I mean,
yeah,
it seems so at this point anyway. I mean, maybe it gets much worse, you know, but at least like, I mean, it seems like he's trying to confront racial injustice through this character with his writing. Like,
yeah,
I mean, if he's not, then I'm just confused about why this character's in here at all. And he's doing it in, you know, a 30 to 40-year-old way of talking about it, but like, I don't know what the way of talking about it was in the 80s. So how can, you know, you kind of have to judge people somewhat by the standards of their times, plus or minus.
Yeah. And the one thing I never wanted and don't want the show to be is just like hot takes about problematic 80s things. Like I think that's like this thing in the 80s is not good compared to now is like one of the most boring takes in the world to me. It's like, yes, of course it's not.
Right. I mean, I mean, certainly we're trying to talk about storytelling and writing and like why the author chooses to make certain choices. And that whole discussion is just a political discussion. It's not about storytelling. It's not about character. It's not about any of that. It's literally just unrelated almost. I want to minimize that myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That being said, the book is going to use the N-word multiple times, and we're going to go ahead and make the creative decision to not say that word ever.
Yeah.
Even if we're reading a passage that it happens to be in, we're not going to say it.
Sounds good to me, buddy.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good call there. I mean, it's just like I wonder, like, I don't know. I understand. Like, I think the word use is important, right? Like, it's important in the context of where it's used here, but that doesn't mean we have to contribute to it.
Yeah, right.
So just not going to do that.
I mean, he definitely he seems to use it in ways where he's making, like, it's intentional. It's a specific point he's making when he does use it.
Yeah,
so. So just to riff on your assertion that like she actually has dissociative identity disorder and not schizophrenia, like that's exactly the kind of quote unquote mistake. Like as he is making with the racial stuff, I suppose. Like it's language that we think of as being out of date and mistaken, but I think that in the 80s, that's just what most people called that.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, yeah, it's wrong, but also it's sort of pointless to point it out in a 1980s book, other than for the sake of being like, yeah, I mean, that's how it is. And like I feel confident that books published in 2020 that seem perfectly inoffensive and even forward-looking to us will somehow manage to seem reactionary and cringy when youngsters read them in 2060. So
yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right there. I think that's just how progress generally works, right? We don't even know the things that we're doing right now that we will recognize as not being great down the road. But yeah, I mean, like my concern is not the labeling it of schizophrenia. Like, my concern is just that whenever you start, like we talked about this when we talked about the movie Split on our other podcast, that when you start like using this mental disorder as a plot point, there are moments where you could like step in it a little bit when you're not really being accurate at all. I don't think that matters that much in this book, a book where things are so generally weird and different and otherworldly. Like, I don't think anyone's like, oh, well, this is clearly not how DID works, and therefore it's terrible that we did this to this character. It's a little different than that.
Yeah, like, I mean, my first suspicion was that this is some kind of supernatural thing in any way. I mean, there's, I think we'll talk about it later, but there are certain words used to describe Detta that I'm just like, that just kind of seems like you're implying that this is like a demonic possession, actually, and that it only looks like DID because people don't know, this is a Stephen King book. So
Sure.
I mean, I don't know if I have no idea how things are going to play out. But
yeah.
But that was my like almost first thought when we start to see how Detta is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we want to keep in mind as we learn more about these characters and how that whole thing works. It is
Sounds
very
good.
very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get that out of the way here at the beginning. This is, of course, from the perspective of two white guys. So, I mean, if there are any people of color listening in our audience and you were specifically bothered by certain things that King did here, I want to know about it just, personally from my own awareness of the stuff. Like I can read the stuff all day and not notice anything, where someone else that has different experiences could read it and be very offended. So I'm just curious. I don't really want to like dive into that and make the show about that, as I said, but I am just curious, our listeners out there, what your experience with this is. So
Okay.
anyway, we begin this chapter with Odetta Holmes sitting in her limousine driving back to her New York rich apartment. We get little bits and crumbs of who Odetta is handed to us throughout this conversation. I actually think the way which King like doles out the information to us here is like the best part of it. With the way, like the order in which we learn information. Like we meet Odetta first, then we learn she's rich, then we learn she's black, and then finally we learn she's bound to a wheelchair. And it's just a very interesting like way in which this is slowly revealed to us who this person is.
Yeah, it's really something. It's essentially the inverse of the order in which you would have noticed these things if you saw her with your eyes.
Yeah, true.
I think King's really playing with our preconceived notions here, because when you think limousine, you think rich, and kind of by default, you think white.
Yeah.
And then we're corrected on that point, but then you realize subsequent to that your picture was still off, and it just really kind of forces you to confront the preconceived notions that you have.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think a lot of what Odetta is doing is challenging those preconceived notions, and I love her so much, and I can't wait to talk about her. But I really like focusing on how this is done, and trying to think back of the first time I read this, and this realization that, oh, like the wheelchair thing is a reveal, her being black is a reveal, her being rich is a reveal, that she's in a limo. Like first we just think she's in a car, and then it kind of slowly zooms out, and I totally agree that like, because it's almost as if we're learning about her through Roland's eyes in the ways in which he would realize things, because he's seeing from her point of view. Where like first you notice like this, like you don't notice she's missing legs because you're not looking at you're not looking at her from your perspective, you're looking at her from his perspective, which is through her eyes. So I don't know, it's really interesting.
That's
I like
that's a cool thought. Yeah, it didn't occur to me. I like that.
Yeah. All right. So the first line of this chapter, Matt, is "last gunslinger," Andrew said, which immediately catches our attention for obvious reasons, but it also catches Odetta's attention. And then it causes us to immediately be like, wait, why though? Why would that catch her attention? And so that's like the start of the chapter is immediately asking you questions. And then we learn that Andrew, Odetta's driver, is referring to John F. Kennedy, who was apparently assassinated just 2 months prior to the start of this chapter, which means both Odetta and Detta live in 1964, which happens to be 23 years earlier than where Eddie came from. So it kind of like nicely makes us understand where we are and when we are.
Yeah. So in my head, I predicted that the next character would be from further in the past than Eddie, but I don't think I ever said that out loud. So 0 points, I guess.
Oh, we can give it to you.
Oh, okay. But I really come to enjoy these little pieces of connective tissue, like the gunslinger thing, and the idea that Roland and the tower and the quests are threaded through history in these small ways. And it's all stuff where like it could be nothing, but it could be fate, could be Ka.
Yeah.
And since it does catch Odetta's attention, it's probably not nothing. Like I think maybe she has some kind of premonition or something about what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, and I think the idea that it's related to, she's drawn to use a specific word, to this world and this adventure and this quest, and that is a word that is very important to that world. And so it sticks with her in an interesting way.
Yeah.
One of the things like that I love about this section is Odetta like immediately rejects the idea that Kennedy's a gunslinger. She says, no, Kennedy was a man of peace, not a warrior. He wouldn't fight people like that. And then she goes on to talk about how we don't even need gunslingers. But something sticks in her mind about the statement, and her internal monologue when she says she doesn't believe it calls her a liar, that she does believe it on some level. She believes that this is true and that Kennedy was a gunslinger, and apparently like the last one of our world. So they had Roland and we had Kennedy, and we lost ours.
Yeah, we lost that's really interesting. The way she thinks through this is interesting. First of all, she thinks that a part of her protested, which is a bit ironic considering that she definitely has multiple parts.
Right.
So it's just an interesting phrasing. I like this bit where she says, basically she says, in a world which had become a nuclear powder keg upon which nearly a billion people now sat, it was a mistake, perhaps one of suicidal proportions, to believe that there was a difference between good shooters and bad shooters. And basically she's castigating anyone who would be a shooter. And which I thought was interesting, because like it sounds like wisdom, but if you live in a world where there are inevitably going to be shooters, then you better hope that you've got a good one watching out for you.
Sure.
Like I mean, I feel like we're setting up what her sort of conflict and relationship with Roland is going to be here.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the other things it's doing too is just like it's making this idea of duality, this contrast of two different sides. And I think that is something that thematically is very important to Odetta and Detta, and very important to what these characters are going to represent. You know, one of the things we talked about last week was why Eddie, why these people, and I think this section crystallizes some of those whys for us as we talk through it. And one of those big things is going to be this concept of duality, this concept of identity and the wrestling with one's identity. And so I think like you see good shooters and bad shooters, and you're like, oh, Odetta and Detta. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here, but I agree with you that is a bit naive.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Someone who lives in a time of relative peace can afford to be naive, but like Roland is gonna is gonna be an interest. Like it'll be interesting because Roland is often surprisingly wise and then often incredibly wrong. So it'll be fun to see which way the book takes this. Like is Roland right or is Odetta right? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I like it from the perspective of like, she will look at Roland as the good guy gunslinger, and she will be like, well, there's no difference between good and bad when it comes to people with guns. And that is, I think, perfect way to describe like how we, the reader, have been wrestling with this concept of Roland. Well, he's the good guy. Okay. Yeah. But like, what's he done that's good?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah. She also thinks to herself, this was no world for gunslingers. If there had ever been a time for them, it had passed. Hadn't it? And of course, my reaction was, of course not. It's the future that belongs to the gunslingers because Roland is from the future.
Oh, of course, Matt. Of course.
I'm not letting go of this.
You hold on to it, man. Hold on to it as long as you have to. So we learned that Odetta has just been down to Oxford, Mississippi, where she was jailed for 3 days as part of the movement, which she describes as the Civil Rights Movement. We know since it is 1964 that the Civil Rights Act will be passed this very year. And so she's really confident, and even having to be jailed and having to piss herself because she was in jail for so long, King allows us to know that her efforts are going to be successful, which I think is interesting. And then we have this one paragraph that I think is just like a perfect way to characterize Odetta Holmes, like perfectly. A trying 3 days. Well, that was one way to put it. Another might be that her 3 days in Oxford, Mississippi had been a short season in hell, but there were some things you couldn't say, some things you would die before saying, unless you were called upon to testify them before the throne of God, the Father Almighty, where she supposed even the truths that caused the hellish thunderstorms in that strange gray jelly between your ears. The scientists say that the gray jelly was nerveless, and if that wasn't a hoot and a half, she didn't know what was. must be admitted. I just love this, Matt. Like this is the perfect way for King to characterize Odetta as this woman kind of entirely different from the other two characters we've seen in the book so far. Like she's like, we see firstly that she's more religious than anyone else. The religious references she have here are from belief and not just like references like they were Roland. Like that she's a tough person who will go through this hell but not talk about it. I don't know. I just love this as just like a snapshot of who she is.
Yeah, just this paragraph, the idea that she says it one way and then she says it a different way is yet again, I think, hitting on that duality.
Yeah.
There's two different ways of expressing this. One of them to the world, one of them inside. It also kind of foreshadowing this idea that she has these migraines or whatever. I mean, it's probably related to the fact that she's got the brain damage.
Yeah. I guess I'll note here that Odetta Holmes is actually a real person, Matt. She was a singer. She just went by Odetta, but she was a singer in the same era. She was involved in the same era and was very involved in the civil rights movement. King clearly took inspiration for this character from Odetta while drawing the character that he made. But I think it does make it clear that she's not supposed to be the same person. Like the real life Odetta was not heir to a dentistry equipment fortune or anything like that. So like this is a real life person that we've now put into our story. It's just, I think, paying homage to her.
Okay, that's interesting. There's some stuff later on where I was trying to figure out if it was a reference to something, and I was like, well, it seems more like it's a reference to several things that King mashed up into one thing. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But yeah, it's really interesting that Odetta Holmes is a real person, or at least Odetta Holmes is a real name. I definitely didn't know that. But yeah, Odetta seems way more moral than either of Roland or Eddie. She cares about justice. She willingly put herself through hell voluntarily to fight for justice. And I think, I mean, this makes her a bit of a crusader, right? Like her crusade is something that's much more relatable and appealing to us than Roland's cryptic crusade for the tower. Maybe that's just because we don't understand his crusade for the tower, but that is something that makes them similar. Their willingness to put themselves through hell for this, this icon that they want to achieve.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I mean, we're trying to look at ways in which these characters, link up to each other. And with Eddie, it was addiction for the tower, addiction to drugs. And now here we have the nobility and this quest for something. Yeah, I like that. I like that a whole bunch.
Cool.
I never thought of it that way, but that's really good. That's really good.
Yeah, I think it's there. I think it makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool.
The book then touches on Detta, Odetta's separate personality, and mentions that neither know about each other, but Detta, assuming the body like just results in these random disappearances that Ms. Holmes is always able to perfectly explain away, as if her brain is like working overtime to intentionally fill gaps that she doesn't look at herself.
Yeah, I love the writing in this part. This little vignette about Detta and the way that they fail to notice each other just really nails down the mechanics of how her existence works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah. And I really love this bit of characterization we get from Andrew, her driver, who obviously loves and cares for her deeply. We find out that he was originally hired by her father, and then when he passed away, started working for her. And so he's been working for the family for years and years and years. And he's like forced, like there's this moment where he's unloading the car and he looks at what the police officers in Oxford did to Odetta's suitcases. Like they just beat the shit out of them because they knew they couldn't beat the shit out of her because she's famous enough as a black woman in the civil rights movement to be on the cover of Time magazine, that like they didn't have plausible deniability to know who she was, so they just beat her suitcases. And he's really heartbroken for her, and he's worried about her. Like he's worried about her when he's thinking about the time gaps where she disappears for weeks on end sometimes. So it's just this minor character who seems to legitimately care for the person he works for.
Yeah, yet again, Andrew's another fantastic King side character who we'll probably never see again, but I nonetheless fell instantly in love with him and wanted to have a beer with him.
Yeah.
King does a particularly good job here, I think, at sketching out this guy who's like simultaneously a little bit of a blowhard, but also quite caring and sensitive, and just kind of creates a very fun and unique image of a character.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of starts the chapter almost drawing him similar to the cabbie that drove Roland around, or that drove Eddie around, right? Where he's just talking, nonstop talking, and Odetta's just kind of tuning him out in the background. But as we get more time with him, we see a really kind, empathetic person.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we cut over for the first time to Detta Walker. This is the first time we're actually in Detta's head. This is Odetta's other half. And what we get here is like this almost like tour de force of writing, Matt. It's like almost a 2-page long single paragraph as we see Detta like almost in some ways channeling like the same kind of energetic writing that Hi Eddie had back in the first part. But we see Detta as a young woman smashing the blue woman's 4 special plate, which I think we should, if it did not specifically, but should remind you of what the man in black said back in the Gunslinger, that she broke the blue plate was one part of his prediction of her.
Yeah, that was his prediction, and then Roland's like, "What does that mean?" He's like, "I don't know."
Yeah,
also the man in black says she has 2 faces at least.
Yeah,
which is interesting because we know of 2. Maybe there are more sides to Odetta than we realize yet.
Yeah, maybe. But we see like I think the thing that the book makes very clearly here is that this 4 special plate is very, very important to Detta specifically for reasons we don't quite understand yet, because we see here that she's this girl, I'm not sure how old she is, but she's pleasuring herself as she smashes the plate. And then we immediately, amongst the same paragraph, cut to her in a car. She's older, she's with another man, clawing him at the face with her nails, and again, pleasuring herself. So again, King is connecting sexual pleasure and violence inside this character. And these 2 things are kind of inextricably linked in Detta. We don't know yet like how or why she exists, but we know her as this kind of tornado of destruction.
Yeah, and again, the book is connecting sex and violence and magic, maybe. I mean, I say magic because I really suspect there's something magic going on here, but even if there's not, I think there's a pattern. And it's a really fascinating puzzle, though, because you can't help but think that it means something.
Sure.
You know, this whole bit reads as just like a thing where I just want to pour over it a couple times and figure out like, okay, what exactly are we being told here? Because it seems like there's a lot of little mysteries and little hints here.
Yeah.
What role does Detta serve? Why does she need to exist? From whence does she come? I mean, stuff like this is just tantalizing and really wants me to, or really makes me want to read more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I think that is definitely something we're going to learn more about, especially next week. Our first chapter we're covering next week is titled Detta on the Other Side. So we're going to get to see some of her for sure. And we'll learn a little bit more about the who's and the whys of Detta Walker, or Detta Holmes. Detta Walker.
Detta Walker, which is interesting. It's interesting she has a different last name. That's something that stuck out. I was like, okay,
she's got a different last name. She also has an entirely separate apartment all the way across town.
Uh-huh.
It's really interesting the way they've gone out of their way to like build their own lives, even though one of them exists much less often than the other.
Right, and somehow they specifically said Detta also doesn't know about Odetta. So
yeah.
So presumably she maybe sometimes finds herself in this rich woman's house.
Yeah,
and then leaves. Yeah, it's very interesting.
But we do know that while Odetta like builds these complex narratives to explain her blackout periods, Detta is at least aware of the blackout periods. Like I think the text specifically says she's aware that someone's fucking with her life. And here we end this chapter, or this part of the chapter, on. So sometimes she wondered, in a distracted sort of way, where she was when she wasn't there. But mostly her needs were too sudden and pressing for any extended contemplation, and she simply fulfilled what needed to be fulfilled, did what needed to be done. Roland would have understood.
Yep. Roland is the king of not thinking too hard about the implications.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like, it brings out like this idea of her existence is almost primal, right? Like she comes forward in these heightened moments of violence and sexual energy, does her thing, and then goes away. And that's and is just like, yeah, whatever. I'll just do this because I'm here. This is what I'm here for, and then I'm just gonna go away, and I won't question it, which is really interesting.
Right? Yeah. It's like. It really begs the question: does Detta exist to sort of discharge some like unacceptable impulses that Odetta feels, or is that too clinical of an explanation? Is it more like she is her own separate entity? Yeah, I don't know. I wonder. I have no idea what direction the book is going to take with this idea. So
Yeah,
exciting.
It's really, really, really great. We then cut back to Odetta, and we kind of go through her life story and show how she, despite being the daughter of a rich man, got pulled into the civil rights movement. Like, she was this young girl that was embarrassed by her richness, and she like would elect to dress casually and take public transport and hang out in the village with folk singers, and that's when she kind of got pulled into this whole civil rights thing. And there's this really great moment where she's trying to talk to her parents, specifically her father, about what his life was like before he was rich. Like, him being rich has afforded him rights amongst black people that no one else has, and she's trying to understand what life was like before, but he doesn't want to talk about it. And there's this great moment that ends the section where it says, "Then he had looked at her, a thin black man, thin almost to the point of emaciation, tightly kinked gray hair now drawing rapidly away from deepening hollows of his temples, where tender clock springs of veins pulsed steadily. And he had said only, 'I don't talk about that part of my life, Odetta, or think about it. It would be pointless. The world has moved on since then.' Roland would have understood." So not only do we get some great repetition here.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, man, like the description for one thing is amazing. Tender clock springs is a search term that only comes up in Dark Tower context, FYI.
Yeah, it's not like a phrase that's used in King's like, "Ooh, that sounds great." He just invented it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't even necessarily know what a clock spring looks like, but the idea of describing like the veins pulsing in someone's temples is just gorgeous. Implying how thin you would have to be to see the veins beating.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea that the world has moved on is obviously, Roland's world moved on in a very overtly magical way. But that concept is being connected with the way the way social mores have changed, and the times they are changing on Earth in normal times. So
yeah, definitely. And I pulled out both of these paragraphs because I wanted to. What we've done here is connected both Detta and Odetta to Roland through these long paragraphs of description, ending with "Roland would have understood." Right, like, so both of them have moments of their life that at least resemble moments in which Roland behaves. And it's interesting to me that Roland here is like, what Roland would understand with Detta is how Detta is. What Roland would have understood with Odetta is not Odetta herself, but rather how her father was. And maybe that shows how the two's relationship with Roland are going to differ.
That's true, but also just a minute ago we talked about how she to other people she would say, "Oh, it was a trying 3 days," but to herself she would admit how it had been a short season in hell, and that is basically her sort of taking on her father's way of thinking in that she's not going to admit how much it sucked. Now, her father also didn't become a civil rights activist, and she did become a civil rights activist, so she's clearly willing to face up to these things in a way that her father apparently wasn't.
Yeah.
But also this like kind of steadfast, uncomplaining nature might actually be something that Roland connects to. I don't know.
Yeah, now that you say that, I totally agree, and I want to kind of go further with it because I think her propensity to deal with Detta via just bullshit explanations links to that pretty well, because she's just like, it's pointless to think about that. Oh, I was just, what do you mean, where was I? I was just, where I was around.
Yeah.
What do you mean, where did that bruise came from? I just slipped in the bath.
Right.
And so it's like that general idea that looking back at that, thinking about that part of her life, thinking about these holes in her life would be pointless. So yeah, I think you're totally right there. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, the idea of characters refusing to or failing to notice or examine their lives, I think, is something that draws all four of these characters together.
Sure. Yeah.
All
right. So we finally temporarily leave Detta and Odetta behind and catch up with our protagonist. We haven't seen him in a bit, but we catch up with Eddie and Roland as they stand in front of the open door into Odetta's mind. She's shopping, as she had indicated to her driver she was going to do. And I love what here, Matt, what Roland sees as this dizzying movement that he can't quite track to Eddie is just reminiscent of a point of view Steadicam shot from a movie like The Shining, Matt. The Shining is the movie he draws example to.
Oh, I laughed out loud. I mean, I think if this were any other author or any other book, I would just write that off as like a cute little in joke. Mm-hmm. But not in this story, not this author, because we know that he's connecting things together. We know how Stephen King is a person who exists and writes books in this actual world of the story.
Yep, that is true. That is true.
So that's a thing now.
That is what has been established now. Yep.
Yeah.
And he cleverly does it, just kind of a throwaway line here. And I love, I don't know, like The Shining is a movie that Stephen King does not like. He does not like, that's like one of his least favorite adaptations of his books ever. So for him to pick that movie, I think is just wonderful.
I noticed that. I was like, it's so funny to me because he would fully acknowledge that like it's one of his most well-known, if not the most well-known movie from one of his books. And so of course Eddie would know about it. And maybe Eddie's never seen another Stephen King movie. Which is just hilarious. Actually, maybe in the mid 80s maybe that was like all there was. I have no idea, honestly.
No, I'm pretty sure Carrie was around by 87 some of the other ones. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, and I think what if Eddie like fucking loves The Shining? Like what if that's like his favorite movie? What does that say?
He loves how Jack just dies at the end unceremoniously. It's the best part.
Yep. That's his favorite part.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's so great. So we're in Eddie's head and he realizes that they're in the past, not your win, as Roland puts it. And one thing I love subtly is that later in the book, that is exactly how Eddie is describing it, as I'm not from your win, which like granted is probably, I don't know how else you would describe time travel to someone, but I just love how he mirrors Roland's speech. And I remember how quickly Jake started mirroring Roland's way of speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's from the past relative to your time, but
sure,
Roland wouldn't say that. And then I mean, it's good to point out Eddie is totally starting. I mean, Eddie definitely has his own patois, but it is interesting that he picks up a few Rolandisms here and there. Yeah,
but even though he's not in Eddie's New York, it's still New York, and New York still has drugs. And then we do this great thing where we cut over to Roland as he watches Eddie and like has already come to the realization that Eddie's about to come to and is just waiting for him to do it himself. And I think this just goes to show, like we've made jokes about Roland and being dumb. He's not dumb. He just doesn't think about certain things, right? He's just like this plodding, like kind of shark who just goes forward, but he's not like strategically, he can be pretty smart. And so he comes to the conclusion that Eddie's going to come to like fractions of a second before him.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because he's sort of always solving the problem that's immediately in front of him, even if like around the next corner, it predictably is going to be a disaster. And I mean, I think of it as like Eddie and Roland are both two guys who you could mistake for dumb because they make terrible self-destructive choices and say weird things like Tudor fish popkin and get into naked gunfights. And what was I saying? Anyway, I mean, I like what the story is doing with this idea of like a guy who is super like hyper competent, but also like critically bad at self-examination to the point where you don't even know if he knows why he's on this quest that he's on.
Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah. I think it does help because like with a character that examines more, he would be kind of forced to examine why he's doing this thing. Right. And King doesn't want to give up that yet. He wants to hold that onto that. And I think that's important. I think like it's not just, I want to do the reveal of what the journey, like why he's journeying to the tower. I think to King, his point here is that it doesn't matter that Roland knows or doesn't know, or that we know or don't know. We know he's driven to it, and that's enough. That is enough to define him as a character. So
Yeah, I think you're right, and it makes us very curious, but it's not like we find it unrealistic. So.
Sure. I do really like, so there's, as they're figuring out stuff, I really like the writing here. He looked back at Roland, smiling without showing his teeth, twirled the gunslinger's revolver once on his finger, clumsily, burlesquing a show shooter's fancy coda, and then he held it out to Roland, butt first. This thing might as well be a piece of shit for all the good it can do me. Isn't that right? You can talk bright when you want to, Roland thought. Why do you so often choose to talk stupid, Eddie? Is it because you think that's the way they talked in the place where your brother went with his guns? I first of all, like, he twirled the gunslinger's revolver once on his finger, clumsily burlesquing a show shooter's fancy coda is just like delicious writing that I love forever.
Verbing burlesque.
Like, I love Stephen King. But
yeah,
I really do like this part about, like, Roland is like, why do you talk that way? Like, you talk, you make yourself sound stupider than you are by choice. And like this idea of like, is it because that's the way they talked in the place where your brother went with his guns, talking about when Henry went to Vietnam, went to war. And so like he's putting on an affect, and Roland is kind of seeing through it.
Thanks for decoding that, because I was like, does went with his guns, is that like a gunslinger way of saying died? Are they talking about like the mob den? And now I realize, like, no, it's what you just said. It's
Vietnam.
When he went to Vietnam, and he sort of like wants to be a grown up like his brother. I think that's where his head is.
Yeah. He's trying to talk like a soldier. He's trying to talk tough. He's trying to talk like and he just makes it like he's smarter than that, and he should know it, is kind of what Roland's saying here. Yeah, it's really good. So they both realize that the door is connected to Roland, and if Roland dies, the door goes away. And so Eddie tries to then renegotiate the situation and negotiate his way into coming with Roland. He just wants to get some takeout chicken, maybe a box of Dunkin' Donuts, or maybe some drugs.
Yeah.
This is another, I don't know how aware of this you are, but King is like notorious for, he can't just say a box of donuts. It has to be branded. Everything with King is branded. And I think like it's something that people joke about a lot with King, but I do think it gives the world this sense of reality, right? It's like I'm not gonna go get a coffee. I'm gonna go get some Starbucks. Like that's the way people really talk. That's just how brands are such an integral part of our lives that we refer to them constantly. And to just cut all the brands out for the sake of writing your story, it feels a little false. And King has always written that way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is not the omniscient narrator talking. This is Eddie saying, I'm going to get me some Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah.
And then, of course, from a writing perspective, even if that weren't the case, like as soon as when you say the phrase Dunkin' Donuts, I get a literal visual flash of a box of Dunkin' Donuts. My mouth starts to water a little bit. I see the logo of the Dunkin' Donuts logo on the box. And it's like, mental programming, right? It's pushing buttons that King knows are in your brain to craft a better, more real, more immediate image. And I think this is kind of one of the many, many tricks that he employs that get us sucked into the story. Like I mean, people who make fun of it, I'm like, okay, this guy is like a writing monster. You should learn from him, right? Like maybe you think he does it too much, random listener, but like I definitely see it as a thing that he's doing on purpose for effect, and it's having the desired effect most of the time.
Sure. Yeah. I would be very surprised if any of our random listeners thinks he does it too much, but there are people out there who tease King for this tendency.
Yeah. I mean,
I agree with you 100% though.
I think every writer has their quirks that it's fun to make fun of, but that doesn't mean that people think that it's actually bad, is what I would say.
Yeah, no. And like you said, everything has a point, everything has a reason. There's a reason why he's doing this, and it's because he feels it connects you better with the world and with the characters. And in that, I think he's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So there's this I love this quote so much. Eddie is basically like begging to go get there just to get some drugs, and Roland's just like, "No, you're done." He says, "Until after the tower, at least, that part of your life is done. After that, I don't care. After that, you're free to go to hell in your own way. Until then, I need you. "Oh, you fucking shit-ass liar," Eddie said softly. There was no audible emotion in his voice, but the gunslinger saw a glisten of tears in his eyes. Roland said nothing. "You know there ain't gonna be no after. Not for me, not for her, whoever the Christ this third guy is. Probably not for you either. You look as fucking wasted as Henry did at his worst. If we don't die on the way to your tower, we'll still as shit die when we get there. So why are you lying to me?" The gunslinger felt a dull species of shame, but only repeated, "At least for now, that part of your life is done." So we mentioned last week that the camaraderie between Roland and Eddie like came up really quick, but then melted away very, very quickly the second he followed him through the door into Roland's world. And I think we talked about how it was probably because of the death of Henry and the realization of the true consequence of this choice he just made. But I think one of the things we left out is probably the most important thing. Roland is standing between Eddie and his score, and you can't. And if you stand between a junkie and their score, they're gonna hate you.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. It also seems like Eddie just very rapidly sizes Roland up as the tower fiend that he is.
Sure.
And correctly gauges that he would absolutely sacrifice Eddie if it came down to it. Which I mean is interesting because it reminds me of the moment when Jake also kind of very suddenly gets exactly the right read on Roland. When he needs to. And you know, the book did spend a bunch of pages punishing Roland for what happened at the end of the last book, but I don't think it wants to let us forget that Roland killed a boy. And here, like, Eddie doesn't know that happened, but he sort of might as well. Like, he gets such a good read on Roland that he could probably guess that Roland has done things like that.
Yeah. And like when he says this stuff here, you believe him, right? Like, this isn't the first time we've talked about the idea that like there's not going to be an after. Like you get to the tower, Roland himself believes everything that Eddie is saying here because he thought almost exactly this last week. He thought these same thoughts and he couldn't lie to himself. Like this idea that like, well, once we get to the tower, then they can do whatever they want. And he called himself a liar in that, or rather the man in black as the voice in his head did. And now here we have Eddie echo that same thing out loud. And he can't do anything. He just feels a dull species of shame, which I love that phrase. That's great. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this repetition is really, really kind of starting to push into us this idea that this is a one-way trip and they're going to keep going on it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So Roland attempts to comfort Eddie by telling him that, yeah, okay, it's going to be bad. We're probably all going to die, but we're going to have like fabulous adventures. And you could become a gunslinger one day too, Eddie. And that goes about as well as you would expect, where Eddie like immediately once again like noting that his brother was a gunslinger, a soldier, and that didn't turn out well for him. Noting that Cuthbert, this person that it says Roland talks about in his sleep, was a gunslinger, and he's dead too. And so once again, as we just talked about, Eddie continues to just nail Roland for his shit again and again and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he's right. It's a great moment. I like this idea that Roland is not as cool and in control as he thinks he is because he's talking in his sleep, and other people around him can see his demons even if he can't see them. And overall, King just paints this whole sequence in the most deliciously dramatic way possible. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, because like if you think about it, he could have had them become buddies and walk their way down the beach and find Odetta's door and be like, well, old chum, how are we going to solve this? But instead it's like this complex conflictual and dramatic sequence where, I mean, it went from shuffle and then it gets to here and just everything is just as tense as it could possibly be.
Yeah, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, who is the antagonist of this book, right? And for now, if our protagonist remains Roland, the antagonist is the three. That is Eddie, is Odetta, and then maybe a little bit more explicitly by the end of this section is Detta. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where our conflict is coming from, is between Roland and these characters he's drawing into this story. Yeah,
I like that, because by the end of this week's reading, he's just drawn in two people who aren't too pleased with the fact that he did that. So
yeah. All right, so in the middle of this Mexican standoff, both look back through the door and see that Odetta is suddenly shoveling cheap jewelry into her bag, and the connotation here is that she's changed over to Detta, which will get confirmed a little bit in next chapter. But I love how Eddie says, "Well, you're collecting quite a crew, Roland. First you got a basic white junkie, then you got yourself a basic black shoplifter." It's funny, but also like we do see a pattern emerging, right, where the people that are being drawn are not like fully well-adjusted, doing great people. They're people that have problems and they're suffering and they're broken in certain ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like Odetta seems like almost unimpeachable, but then she's got this dark side to her, and you start to wonder like, well, is that part of her or is that separate from her, or how do you think about this exactly? And I have no idea at this point.
Yeah.
But
so then in the middle of that sentence, Roland runs through the door and into Detta Walker, leaving Eddie back on the beach, who just like takes Roland's knife and just holds it to his throat because he doesn't know what else to do.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then we move on to the next chapter, chapter 2, Ringing in the Changes. This is a weird chapter in this book, Matt. It's not quite like anything we've seen before. At the beginning of the chapter, we get something we haven't seen in any book in the series before, which is a date stamp. It lists the date as August 1951, or 1959, rather. We are immediately after the accident that took Odetta's legs off. We meet George, an intern at Sisters of Mercy Hospital that was assigned to ride along with some paramedics that happened to be there when Odetta had her accident. And in what should be seen as just king-ishness now, the opening of this chapter takes a very long time to explain and explore who George is, the intern at this hospital.
Yeah, we spend so much time with George that it's hard to believe that we won't see him again. In any other book, this guy would absolutely be a recurring character after this point. But with King, we might very well never hear from him again, and I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't.
It's full on half of this chapter, maybe more, that we are in George's head. And even before we get to George's role in the book, we learn about George himself. We learn about the plane crash that he was on earlier. I think it was 4 weeks before this thing. They responded to this plane crash, and it was a horrifying experience where George is telling himself, if you can take this, he thought afterward, remembering the severed limbs lying amid the remains of aluminum flaps and seat cushions and a ragged chunk of tail with the number 17 and a big red letter T and part of a W on it, remembering the eyeball he had seen resting on top of a charred Samsonite suitcase, remembering a child's teddy bear with staring shoe-button eyes lying beside a small red sneaker with a child's foot still in it. If you can take this baby, you can take anything. And that's just like a horrifying sequence.
Yeah, the idea that, man, I don't know what to say. Like it's horror, but it's totally real shit, right? Like stuff like this actually happens and people have to deal with it. Doctors have to go actually face that. I mean, it's funny because when you read a book where, I mean, I know this isn't really a quote unquote horror novel, but anytime I'm reading King, you're kind of mentally prepared for something horrible to be put in your face to try to upset you. But it's so interesting how like describing what a real life plane crash would be like can be so upsetting because you're like, well, this is real though. This isn't a demonic clown in a storm drain. This is just a real thing that actually happens to people all the time, or not all the time, but often enough, right?
Yeah.
It's upsetting. So
it is really upsetting. And George himself cannot take it. He says he can take it, but that night he has a horrible nightmare and basically resigns himself to quitting. He's not going to be a doctor anymore. Quoting Popeye's motto, "That's all I can stands and I can't stands no more." And Popeye was right as rain. But despite all of this, the next day George decides he still wants to be a doctor. So he is still one 4 weeks later when Odetta gets pushed in front of the subway. And I want to pause on this for a minute, Matt, because I think what I do think King is doing something really subtly clever and important here. I think with all these vignettes, all these side characters we've been talking about throughout this book, we're seeing the people around Roland's drawing of characters that are pushing those characters to their fate. Because we learn here that the only reason Odetta survived being pushed in front of a train and having her legs chopped off is because George was there, tying off veins and arteries, thinking quickly, moving. If he was not there, she probably would have died. And George almost quit. And had he quit, yeah, she would have died. But he didn't. And so she lives. And so we can call this fate. We can call it Ka. We can just call it a chain of cause and effect that we're watching kind of wind out. But King is painting a picture of the lives around the lives of our characters that push them to where they ended up, which push our characters to where they need to be to become part of the story.
Yeah, I'd like that a lot. I mean, I feel like I might be reaching here, but I really like this idea that maybe the reason that this guy was in the headspace that he needed to be in to efficiently save Odetta's life was because a whole plane of people had just been sacrificed to give him sort of the mental fortitude, the nerves for it, to prepare him for it.
Yeah, I hadn't gone that far, but now that you say that, sure. I mean, that's horrifying, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the universe moving pieces around to kind of facilitate Roland, and we have this theme of sacrifice, then I can't help but make the connection that I mean, you could really stretch it and say George got like the power of steadfastness by the sacrifice of this plane, basically.
Yeah.
He went through something awful. So this is the thing I was referencing a while ago, by the way, about like events that sort of line up but not quite, because I spent quite a while trying to find out if this crash that he's talking about corresponded to any real plane crash. And if it was, I couldn't find it. The first thing I learned is that the 60s were a terrifying time to be an airline passenger. There were a lot of airplane crashes. There was a TWA flight crash at Idlewild Airport, which is the location he references. It was actually a midair collision. It was 1960, which is after this date, and it had far fewer passengers than this crash. There was a TWA crash in '59 that much more closely matches this one with 68 fatalities, which is actually really close to the number that he gives. But none of the like flight numbers or dates really line up. And of course, the main thing that makes it not line up is the fact that this crash happened in Italy. So unless he was in Italy, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But it was rainy. It was rain that probably brought down the flight. It was probably a lightning strike, more specifically. So I guess the planes in Italy fall mainly in the rain.
That's awful. Boo.
I mean, it's awful, but like maybe it. I don't know. I'm trying to put something together here. We got a lot of planes in this story, right? We met Eddie on a plane. Now there's a plane that figures tangentially into Odetta's past. We've got the planes in Spain rhyme. Like, seems like the word plane features in this story at kind of a weirdly high number of times.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It does. And I have nothing clever or smart to say about that at all, other than, yeah, planes, man. Planes.
Maybe because King was just on a lot of planes while he was writing this part.
Yeah, he really liked planes. Yeah. Maybe he's like on a plane when he was writing this part. Was like, what if this plane crashes?
I mean, the whole introduction to Eddie's scene does strike me as something that you would think of while trapped in a economy class seat and thinking about story ideas.
That is true. That is true. Let's see. I feel like in 87, King wouldn't be in economy class anymore, but maybe.
That's true.
All right. So we go from this and we now in present time, or we're not, we're like, it's kind of, we're jumping back in time. This chapter starts George at the end of the experience with Odetta and Detta, and then we jump back in time to relive his experience, because King really loves to do this. He really loves to have his characters kind of tell their own stories of their recent past. And that's what we see here, where on the ambulance ride over, King, through George, is once again kind of exploring the Detta and Odetta dynamics. And this time we really get to hear for the first time how Detta talks. And the difference between the two of us, because he's having a conversation with both of them. What has happened to me? She asked. George remembered the man who had told another man about the woman who had supposedly said how she was going to hunt the motherfucker down and kill his ass, etc., etc. That man had been white. George decided now it had been pure invention, inspired by the odd human urge to make naturally dramatic situations even more dramatic, or just race prejudiced. This was a cultured, intelligent woman. You've had an accident. You were... Her eyes slipped shut, and he thought she was going to sleep again. Good. Let someone else tell her she had lost her legs. Someone who made more than $7,600 a year. He had shifted a little to the left, wanting to check her BP again. When she opened her eyes once more, when she did, George Shavers was looking at a different woman. Fucker cut off my legs. I felt him go. This the ambulance? And so this is when George notes that Detta is as we talked about, is talking like a cartoon black woman, and it's really like over the top and ridiculous. Here, but it's really it's a way for us to kind of very clearly see the differences between these two characters.
Yeah. At this point, I think Detta is indeed a separate personality from Odetta, but I think that Detta's way of speaking may be something of a put on. Like,
sure,
stuff like her face was monstrous, her eyes full of hell's own light, being used in the text to describe the transition. It really suggests supernatural influence to me. I mean, I may be completely wrong about this, but like the text really seems to be gesturing at it pretty strongly.
Yeah, I mean, it says right here it wasn't even the face of a human being, which is like that's a loaded as hell.
Right, and she went from being like a beautiful, intelligent, cultured woman to not even a human being, and it's the same face, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
You ain't nothing but a bunch of honky sons of bitches.
Yeah.
Gonna kill every motherfucking honky I see. Gonna geld them first.
Yeah.
Like it's over the top and absurd, but I think you're right. Like it is. I mean, we don't know a lot about this personality yet. We don't really know where it came from or why, but I think it would not be wrong to make the assumption that this is being played up. I mean, I think King is pointing you towards this. The fact, like calling her a cartoon black woman is almost pulling attention to the fact that this is a performance in some way.
Yeah.
Not to saying they are not different people. This is not Odetta putting on a performance. They are very clearly two distinct personalities.
That's what I was trying to say. I'm not sure if it came across, but yeah, I wonder if Detta like isn't going to drop this act at some point and act in some completely different third way, not like Detta and not like Odetta either.
Yeah. It's really fascinating.
Maybe that's what the Man in Black was meaning when he said at least two faces. Like Detta is a put on from some other personality. I don't know. I'm super into this though.
Yeah. I think let's pay attention to that as we keep going because this dynamic is so fascinating to me too. Mm-hmm. So they get Odetta to the hospital and they save her, but the conversation at the end of this section between Julian, the guy George was talking to, ends on this sad note here, and I wanted to talk to you about this for a bit. She needs help, man. Who gonna give it? Well, I already gave her one, George said, but his face felt hot, as if he were blushing. Julio looked at him. If you already gave her all the help you can give her, you should have just let her die, Doc. George looked at Julio for a moment, but found he couldn't stand what he saw in Julio's eyes. Not accusation, but sadness. And I mean, a lot of what the book is doing is really trying to pull us to this idea of this being like both figuratively and literally a broken woman. I mean, she's broken in half in multiple ways, right? Like she's like broken in half physically and mentally. And I just love this idea. Like we see it through these characters that I'm sad to say not gonna see George again.
Oh, no.
So spoilers. We're never gonna see George again. But these characters have just like come in through this world, this like blown their way through the book and seen these characters and just leave them knowing that they need help. But who's going to give it?
Yeah, I mean that's honestly that section didn't jump out to me as hard as it seems to have jumped out at you, but I do agree that it's a beautiful concept that he's worked in here. This idea that she's cut in half in multiple different ways is amazing.
I mean, honestly, the reason it jumped out at me so much is this sentence right here. If you already gave her all the help you can give her, you just should have let her die. Which is like, he just saved this woman's life. Like this woman, like got her legs chopped off by the New York City subway and was bleeding out and dying. And only through the quick acting of this intern was her life saved. That's like hero moment, right? And then one of the other people with him, I think he's one of the paramedics, right? Julio, I think so. He turns to him after this hero moment and says, if that's all you're going to do for her, she probably would have just been better off dead. And that's why it jumped out at me, because I'm like, whoa, that's a powerful statement to say.
I better work on that attitude as a working paramedic.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's just supposed to portray how obviously rough her situation is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, their experience with her is so off-putting and uncomfortable and weird, but they're left with just this profound sadness at this woman that just this came briefly in their life and they saved, but they're still sad about what she's going through.
Yeah. Sure.
So then we cut back to the time of the drawing, as the book says, as Detta, back in the department store, is stealing all kinds of shit right as Roland invades her head. Interestingly enough, Matt, Detta is aware enough of the presence the second Roland steps through the door to recognize him, and not only recognize that there is a presence inside her head, but the fact that he's a honky, he's white, and that freaks her out even more, and she fights back. She's unsuccessful in her fighting back, but she fights back. She tries to push him out of there. And it's interesting because with Eddie, not only did he not notice Roland until he spoke, but when Roland stepped forward to control Eddie, Eddie just blacked out and wrote it off. Detta is not only aware, but she fights him.
Yeah, this is just so interesting. King keeps throwing us these curveballs because, like, we think this time around, this ought to be easy because Roland can leverage the rules that he learned with Eddie, but Detta doesn't follow those rules. She's special somehow.
Yeah. And I think maybe part of this can be explained by the fact that she's used to having another presence inside her head. And unlike Odetta, Detta has learned to just accept the spots like where Eddie just like blacks out. Eddie is not aware of his blackouts. Detta was aware of the blackouts when Odetta took over. Like she knows it's there. She just doesn't really inspect it very much. And so it kind of makes sense logically that she notices it here too.
Yeah, this kind of there's this theory that I've been working on where just playing into a bunch of the themes of the story and the ideas that we have in play here, that like Roland was supposed to draw one of these two specifically, and I think it would be an interesting twist if, like, clearly Odetta is the one we're supposed to like more, but what if Detta is the one that he was supposed to draw?
I mean, look, the Lady of Shadows.
Right.
Which one of the two is in the shadows more often?
Yeah. That's the kind of thing that, and just like the idea that Roland would be in a situation where he has the option of like sacrificing Odetta in favor of Detta. That sounds like a situation that King would put in this book, understanding the way it has worked so far.
Yeah, great. That's great. I love it. So despite the fact that Detta fights against her, Roland is still able to take control, and he steers Detta and her chair out of the way of store security, who have noticed her stealing because she screamed when Roland came into her head. And so they're chasing after her now as Roland rolls her into a changing room and then immediately draws her into Roland's world. So that's it. The drawing in this section is done already. And Roland didn't ask like he asked Eddie. He just did it. And it wasn't the climactic moment of the chapter. It's like about the halfway point of the chapter at this point. And I'm curious if the structure of this surprised you a little bit. This is very different from how part one went.
Yeah, it surprised me very much. I thought there was going to be like a drawn out sequence where Roland and Odetta get to know each other first. But when you think about it, this actually makes more sense because the only real reason that Roland took his time with Eddie was that he didn't realize that he could just fucking grab him. It took time to figure that out, and now he knows. And it's not like Roland is a man to take his time on something when he could just do it right away.
Right. And the situation that King has painted here is one of immediate need too. He has to do this right away because she's being chased. So
right.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to get into another police station situation with her.
Yeah, absolutely. So we start chapter 3, titled, fittingly, Odetta on the Other Side. And this is our final chapter of the week, and we open it with Roland, Odetta, and Eddie all on the beach. And there's one of the first things of the chapter is this little section here that I just love. Not long after, Roland would think any other woman, crippled or otherwise, suddenly shoved all the way down the aisle of a mart in which she was doing business, monkey business, you may call it if you like, by a stranger in her head, shoved into a little room while some man behind her yelled for her to stop, then suddenly turned, shoved again where there was by rights no room in which to shove, then finding herself suddenly in an entirely different world. I think any other woman, under those circumstances, would have most certainly have asked, "Where am I?" before all else. Instead, Odetta Holmes asked almost pleasantly, "What exactly are you planning to do with that knife, young man?" I just love that. I love that so much.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean that's the thing is Odetta is also her own. I think she has the steel too, right? Like we keep hearing about this idea of there being steel in Eddie and in Roland, and I think Odetta clearly has it. She's tough, right? She's someone who puts herself through these hellacious things. She's a crusader, and the idea that she's going to enter into this other dimension, and the first thing she says is such an unexpected and like pragmatic thing to say.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. And I kind of want to I want to like zoom in on the use of monkey business here, because I think that's like connotationally like really awful. I mean, the book has already connected the idea of monkey as a derogatory term, right? Very early in the first chapter, that is what Detta says the law people of Oxford, Mississippi think she is.
Mm-hmm.
And then in this moment we have Roland, and I don't think he means it in that kind of way, but there is some connotation there, and Roland is a kind of a lawman of his own world, so that has now shoved her not in a jail cell this time, but in a cell of a whole different world.
Yeah, right. It's interesting because we don't know if there is racial prejudice in Roland's world.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
We don't know if that word would have connotations to him. This is his mind. This is his word choice.
But I mean, surely King was aware of that usage.
Sure. I mean, because honestly, you could just leave out that little parenthetical and
right. It's like the text stops to draw attention to that use there.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of it exactly. Why that's there, rather than not being there.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of these things where I'm like, well, yep, I see that you did that. I don't know what you're going for exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think King sat down at his keyboard and was like, "Now I'm gonna be racist." Right. Like, I think there is a specific there, and I wonder if we're trying to draw some attention to some prejudices that might exist in Roland's world as well, or just draw the. I mean, there's a lot of connection between the rest of this chapter and what happened to her in Oxford, and maybe that's helping. This is helping set up that connection.
Yeah, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, let's go with that.
All right, good. I'm glad we got to the bottom of that, kind of. So Odetta not only asking, "Where am I?" Or asking, "What are you doing with that knife?" She keeps asking more questions, and they're all normal questions that someone would ask. But the question that really catches Roland's attention the most is, "Who am I?" Which is a question that she asks them before she asks, "Who are you?" And it's almost as if like identity is like a big theme of this section or something.
Nah. Yeah, it's cool how Detta is obviously weird and maybe magical, but Odetta is also like this force to be reckoned with. Throughout this entire interaction, you feel like Odetta somehow has the upper hand despite being at a complete disadvantage. I think part of this is because of how quickly Eddie takes to her.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I mean, she is calm, she is collected. Like the conflict that takes place in this chapter is not like specifically external. It is Eddie trying to convince Odetta that this is real. that is the conflict of this chapter. And so like she's holding all the cards, if you will. She's in control and he's trying to win her over and doesn't succeed.
Right. Yeah, it's more like they're just trying to get her kind of cooperation and buy-in, and because really she can't pose an effective physical threat to them in this form. So
yeah.
So
Roland and Eddie are both very confused as to why Odetta is confused in the manner in which she is. How come she doesn't know? I can't say. Shock, I suppose. Shock took her all the way back to her living room before she left Macy's. You're telling me the last thing she remembers is sitting in her bathrobe and listening to some blow-dried dude talk about how they found that gonzo down in the Florida Keys with Krista McAuliffe's left hand mounted on his den wall next to his prize marlin? So, I mean, this is a perfect way to paint the picture of why they're confused and like the mystery of what's going on with Odetta, which is a mystery that we already know. But on top of that, it's like a fucking ghastly thing to both write about and say in 1987. Like, so for those that don't know, Krista McAuliffe is the school teacher that was aboard the Challenger that exploded in 1986. So this is, well, not only when this book was written, when the book takes place, it was a year after that. So like, what the fuck, Steven? This is brutal. This is brutal. Like, I want to say what the fuck, Eddie, but also what the fuck, Steven.
Yeah, I'm gonna do myself a favor and just not Google anything along the lines of Challenger explosion, severed hand, and just assume that King made this up entirely.
Well, you're lucky because I already did it, and it seems that King made it up entirely. Yeah,
Jesus, thank God.
I read a lot about the Challenger. Which, by the way, did you know that it didn't explode?
I mean, yes, I know how horrible it was for.
Yeah, it was awful. It was awful. They were alive for 3 minutes.
Well, the booster exploded and the shuttle just kept going.
And and then fell at 200 miles. It's awful. It's awful. Yeah. The point is, what this I think actually does for us is orient us in Eddie's time, because I don't think that's anything. I don't think the book had done that yet. When we were talking, we kind of said, "Oh, Eddie comes from Jake's world," and we knew that. But Eddie does not come from Jake's time. Eddie comes from 1987, which is we get told explicitly here. And I think like referencing the Challenger is a great way to kind of clue you into that. And also just fucking ghastly, because I mean, you think when he wrote this book, it must have like just happened. It must have like just happened. Steven.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is downright weird that Eddie uses this reference, because at this point, doesn't he know that she would have no idea what the Challenger is, and there wouldn't be a blow-dried dude? And
yeah, I mean, he's already recognized that she comes from before he does. So yeah, I mean, I think this is just like an Eddieism, right? Where he just like, this is just what he does.
Yeah,
and he goes for some of I'm joking, being upset with Steven. Like, I think it's great. Like, I think it is in line with exactly what we would have believed of Eddie, which is he's gonna use pop culture references, but in like the most horrible way possible.
Yeah. I mean, this is very much an Eddie thing. Mm-hmm. In fact, I want to talk about this later. Actually, this specific way that Eddie is.
Sure. All right. So then we jump back in time a little bit, and we relive Eddie's experience of watching Roland's adventure through the door. So the entire time Roland was wheeling the wheelchair, we are now seeing it through Eddie's point of view. And he compares it once again to The Shining again, Matt, this time making it a bit more explicit that, yes, he is talking about the Kubrick film made based on the Stephen King book. He is not just talking about like just a coincidence that it's just another movie called The Shining. No, this is The Shining. He references the twin girls and the long hallways in the hotel. And then we get this part, and this is really important, I think. So then the view pivoted, and Eddie was looking at himself. The view rushed towards the viewer, and he wanted to put up the hand holding the knife to shield his eyes, because all at once the sensation of looking through the two sets of eyes was too much, too crazy. It was going to drive him crazy if he didn't shut it out. But it all happened too fast for him to have time. The wheelchair came through the door. It was a tight fit. Eddie heard its hubs squeal on the sides. At the same moment, he heard another sound, a thick tearing sound that made him think of some word, placental, that he couldn't quite think of because he didn't know he knew it. So let's talk about placental here. Is Odetta being born?
Yeah, that's a very interesting take here, that she's being, birthed through this canal into a new world. I mean, first of all, who writes like this, man? Like that. It makes him think of a word he can't think of because he doesn't know he knows it. Like, this is what I mean about King being a genius of psychology. I feel like he must have like an extraordinarily powerful spotlight in his head that he can shine into the weird, uncomfortable, unusual corners of mind, so that he can come up with the strange but instantly recognizable turns of phrase like this.
Sure.
Or for that matter, for the creepy horror stuff. Like, because like, what he means by this. Like, you get it. It's just like, I've never seen anything like that written on a page.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I especially love the fact that Eddie knows the word, but he doesn't know that he knows it.
Right.
Like, it's just so, it seems so human to me. Like, this idea that like, that's kind of the fractured weird way in which our memory works, where we relate it to something, but we can't remember the thing that we remember.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, like, he hears the thick tearing sound. I don't remember there being a thick tearing sound when he came through.
No. This to me is almost like explicitly like
something
Odetta shenanigan-y. Yeah, because
yeah, like some barrier between her and Detta being ruptured or something.
Right. Like, because the wheelchair made the sound of it squeaking against the sides.
Right.
But this is a tearing independent of that. This is not a physical sound being created by them being pushed through. This is like a magical sound. And yeah, I think this is like, as we know in this moment, Odetta switches because Roland is in Detta's head as he drives her through the door. And then it is Detta on the other side.
Yeah.
Or Odetta on the other side, rather. So
right.
yeah, they switch. Odetta takes control again as soon as he goes to the door, and I think that's what I connected the tearing with, and that's why the birthing imagery like becomes really, really fascinating here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on that there's something related to birthing. I just don't understand their dynamic well enough to really pin down exactly.
Sure.
Beyond that.
Yeah, sure. Roland, for his part, is like really weirded out by what he felt inside Odetta's mind, or rather Detta's mind. He felt the duality of the two individuals. Like, he felt that there were two personalities in here, but he's not sure what to make of it. He describes being in Detta's mind like lying naked in the dark while venomous snakes crawl over you. And there's this moment where he like wants to stay in there and learn more. Like, he realizes there's something he's missing, something he's not quite getting, and he's almost got it, but then it's happening right as he's pushed through the door, and she changes into Odetta, so he loses it. And that's I think the thing that the book really leaves you like tantalizing, wanting more on, is this like he almost had some truism that would make him understand this entire dynamic, and something to do with the Force special plate, I think it says specifically, but he just loses it beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly making us curious because it's like, okay, there's definitely a mystery to be solved here because Roland almost saw the answer to it, and now we have to figure out not only what's the answer, but what was the mystery in the first place. And yeah, this is one of those things that made me think that Detta is the Lady of Shadows and Odetta just got dragged along for the ride.
Yeah, I mean that is interesting. I think we need to pay close attention to that. It's great. It's great. Especially, Lady of Shadow. Like, that's perfect.
Yeah.
But what we do see here is Eddie moves to comfort Odetta immediately. He runs up to her. He hugs her as she cries into his shoulder. And then we get this beautiful spot, Matt, where Roland just like silently looks on. And this is long, but I really want to read it all because I think this is like the most important section in the book.
Okay.
So bear with me, everyone, please. She hugged him and he wept, and Eddie held her and rocked her. And Roland thought, Eddie will be all right now. His brother is dead, but he has someone else to take care of, so Eddie will be all right now. But he felt a pang, a deep, reproachful hurt in his heart. He was capable of shooting, with his left hand anyway, of killing, of going on, slamming with brutal relentlessness through miles and years, even dimensions, it seemed, in search of the tower. He was capable of survival, sometimes even of protection. He had saved the boy Jake from a slow death at the way station, and from sexual consumption by the Oracle at the foot of the mountains. But in the end, he had let Jake die. Nor had this been an accident. He had committed a conscious act of damnation. He watched the two of them, watched Eddie hug her, assure her it was going to be all right. He could not have done that, and now the rue in his heart was joined by stealthy fear. If you had given up your heart for the tower, Roland, you have already lost. A heartless creature is a loveless creature, and a loveless creature is a beast. To be a beast is perhaps bearable, although the man who has become one will surely pay hell's own price in the end. But what should you gain if you object? What if you should, heartless, actually storm the Dark Tower and win it? If there is naught but darkness in your heart, what could you do except degenerate from beast to monster? To gain one object as a beast would only be bitterly comic, to giving a magnifying glass to an elephant. But to gain one's object as a monster, to pay hell is one thing, but do you want to own it? He thought of Allie, and of the girl who had once waited for him at the window, thought of the tears he had shed over Cuthbert's lifeless corpse. Oh, then he had loved. Yes, then. I do want to love, he cried. But although Eddie was also crying a little now with the woman in the wheelchair, the gunslinger's eyes remained as dry as the desert he had crossed to reach the sunless sea. Holy shit, man.
Yeah. So beautiful and haunting. Yeah. I think this Roland stuff, this stuff Roland is thinking about here, has been subtextually present up to this point.
Yeah.
And it being laid out here is great. We've been concerned about how it seems that the universe keeps putting Roland into these situations where, in order to advance on his quest, he has to become a little bit more monstrous, a little bit less righteous and more evil. And he still has enough humanity left in him that it hurts to do this, and that he feels bad about having done this. But we start to wonder how long that state of affairs will persist. How many more Jakes can there be that he can let fall before there's nothing left of him? Before
he descends to a beast. Yeah. And I love that idea, like this beast and monster thing, right? Like if you go to the tower and win it and you're just a beast, well, it's going to be funny. It's just going to be comic. Like right. a beast in a tower is nothing, like giving a magnifying glass to an elephant. But if you are a monster, if you walk through the door, if you walk up those stairs as a monster, you will, like, to pay hell is one thing, but do you want to own it? Like, that is such a powerful phrase. Like and I think you're absolutely right that this has been bubbling under the surface of Roland this entire book, and even some of the book before it. This idea of, if you achieve your goal but lose everything that makes you to do it, is like, that could be the worst possible thing. And he's so torn here because, like, he's looking on as he sees Eddie. Like, Eddie is crying, like, trying to comfort Odetta. She's crying because she doesn't know what goes on. Now he's crying, and we'll learn a little bit later that Eddie has already fallen in love with her, because that's just what fucking Eddie does, apparently. But, like, he wants love. He wants his heart. He wants warmth. He wants these things, but he feels like he can't have them, and he doesn't know what to do. Like, this is so funny to me, because, like, it's a realization that you would think a character would be like, oh, if I have to give up my soul to get to this tower, it's not worth it. And he's had that realization, and yet he has no idea what to do. I do want to love. I do. But as I watch these people cry, these people that just met each other and are showing each other more love than I have capable of showing, my eyes remain entirely dry. And so, like, it's this powerlessness he feels. Yeah.
That's the idea that the tower is the one thing he cares about above all else. We still don't understand why exactly. Mm-hmm. And there's yet enough humanity in him to feel regret and loss, but also he's on the path of continuing to erode at that until he goes from man to beast. I mean, you could almost say he's becoming a beast here, an animal. I mean, beast, I think, is synonymous with animal in his usage here, in that he has lost his humanity. But it's one thing to lose your humanity. It's one thing to replace it with monstrousness.
Yeah. Yeah, and to want, like, I think I do want to love. Like, I want that. Like, that's an acknowledgement of him. Like, yes, I think about these people in my past. I think about Susan. I think about my best friend. Even Allie, I had loved. There was a point in my life I had loved. And even with Allie, that's not too long ago. But he's already lost that because of Jake. I mean, I think, like, it's so... We talk so much about that decision to end the gunslinger where it did, but, like, every moment in this book is circles around that choice of Roland's. Like, every lens which he observes these new characters that King is drawing forth are through the lens of what he did to Jake.
Yeah,
so good.
Right. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, I'm still not, like, happy with what he did to Jake, obviously, but storytelling wise, I more and more understand what the purpose of that choice was and what it will mean to the story.
Yeah.
And I love it. I love it as a storytelling device.
I totally agree. Yeah. So the next part of this chapter is basically just Odetta and Eddie bonding as he attempts to explain who he is and why she is here. And hilariously, Odetta, after, like, hearing the story, sitting on a beach here, just rejects it out of hand, refuses to accept any of it, which the book specifically contrasts with Eddie and his ability to accept things. Eddie just rolled with it. He didn't really reject any of this.
Yeah. I mean, they're basically diametrically opposed. Like, Eddie just rolled with it. Sure, interdimensional cowboy door. Yeah. But Odetta's like, oh, I'm insane. I've gone insane. And then she just accepts that with an equal level of equanimity, actually.
Yeah, you're right. I would, like, what do you think you would do in this situation? which would you be somewhere in the middle, or would you be on one of these poles?
I think I'd just freak out. I think I'd just uncomplicatedly have a freak out.
Cool.
And I'd be like, let me back through my door. Like, where? Okay, what happened? Where am I? There's a door. Okay, let me go back through the door immediately. But and then maybe after I had some time to think about it, I might conclude that I had lost my mind, since that does seem likely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Good
fair.
question.
That's fair. So then we have this part. She listened attentively to Eddie, not speaking at all, her eyes fixed on his. At one moment, Eddie would guess she was 5 years older than he. At another, he would guess 15. There was one thing he didn't have to guess about. He was falling in love with her. So, on the one hand, I fully believe that Eddie Dean is the type of person who just like falls in love with women immediately and constantly. Like, I could totally see him as just like the guy that comes to a party and is like talking to a woman at the party for like 5 minutes, and it's like, I love her. Totally can believe that. I mean, we already kind of see how quickly like he goes the brotherly love route with Roland. But I do think this has something to do with the great and powerful influence of Ka, or whatever you want to call it. That these people were selected for a reason. And to kind of return to that thought that I posed to you last week, the question of why was Eddie drawn first? And it seems to me that the answer could be he was first because he had to be here for Odetta.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it certainly makes sense. Although now I'm forced to imagine what it would look like if they'd been drawn in the reverse order. Like for one thing, Roland would have been forced to fight Detta from the get instead of getting a nice training mission with Eddie. So I can see various reasons why Eddie might have been first. But yeah, that's interesting to think about. I like that.
Yeah. And of course, I think it's fair to say that once again, these people are just drawn to each other, karmically or cosmically or whatever. They just immediately hit it off and fall in love, or at least from one side.
Yeah. We don't know what she thinks of him, really.
No, we don't. I think we'll know what Detta thinks of him because we know how Detta feels about white boys.
That's true.
So Eddie now talks about when he was born in 1964, which happens to be the year Odetta was taken from. That makes him 23, even though he said back in part 1 that he was 21. I don't know if this is just an oopsie. I looked this up, and basically what I got was, it's inconsistent. And that's it. So, but the two have this really interesting conversation where they talk about like the differences in time, and it's this conversation that has always fascinated me. And this is one, like, for whatever reason, this is one of the things that like stuck in my head about this book most of all, is just like this conversation about like how Odetta is like really annoyed and disturbed by what Eddie calls black people. I mean, like calling them black to Odetta is like really insensitive to where I think she calls them colored or something.
Yeah.
And it's just like this really interesting thing about how like the acceptability of words and names shifts over time, and King is kind of using these two characters that live in different times to highlight this difference.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. On the Eddie thing, I mean, maybe Eddie was lying when he said he was 21. So I wanted to talk about Eddie for a second, because it's fun how consistently 1980s centric Eddie is, despite the fact that he's with somebody from his past and somebody from his future. I'm gonna keep going with that. He still thinks of them as just like weirdos. He's like, you wacky people, and it's like they have the culture of their time, and so do you. Why are you acting like you're? It's like a Marty McFly thing where he's like he's making fun of them because he knows the viewer is looking over his shoulder, and it's funny. But like King also gets to have fun juxtaposing these three cultural epochs and pointing out similarities and surprising similarities and differences between them. Like how Roland has no trouble grasping Eddie's situation despite having to map everything onto his own, fantasy concepts and words, and Eddie is able to kind of relate to Odetta's situation, and I just like how it's I don't think it's just set dressing that they're all basically from different time periods. I think he's able to make some connections about like human nature by drawing these characters from different time periods.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there, and I think that's why this part stuck with me so much throughout the years, because I do think that's just There's just this idea is fascinating of the things that link us through time culturally and the things that fundamentally shift over time. And it's like language shifts. Obviously, language has shifted even from the 80s to today. Like there's I think part of this conversation that Eddie is having with Odetta, he uses some really, really insensitive words, like some homophobic phrases, like real bad stuff. But in the 80s, that was way less of a big deal. That like hell, like in the 90s, like hell in the 2000s, that
Yeah.
would like these phrases were used much more commonly, and now they're absolutely unacceptable. And that's just kind of how culture shifts over time. And I think it's really fun to see that examined through these characters.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all you said is everything you said is absolutely right. It's just funny how Eddie's attitude is consistently like, yeah, well, my time is right, and the way I talk is right.
Yeah. And I mean, I think because out of any of them, Eddie's time is our time as the reader when this book came out.
Right.
It is the time of the writer when the book was written.
Right.
And so, I mean, it is funny in 2020 looking back at that, and that's just as weird of a culture to us as Eddie's was, or as Odetta's was to Eddie's.
Exactly.
But that's a great pull. I like that you pulled that out. I like that a lot. So Odetta is convinced, the reason why Odetta is convinced this whole thing is a hallucination is because she sustained a head injury when she was a child. They were attending the wedding of her mother's sister called Sister Blue. So that's where our first reference of the blue woman and her 4 special blue plate. Mm-hmm. And a brick fell off the building and hit her right on the head. They don't know, they never find who did it, if anyone did it. They don't know. And so it just gets marked down as an accident. But there is this real sense here that Odetta's parents don't believe it was an accident at all.
Yeah. So here's time for a theory. Odetta has people trying to kill her. Maybe the man in black did it. He does like pushing people in front of things that subsequently crush them. Maybe somebody else. I don't know. Maybe Ka. Maybe it's just Ka is moving various forces around to create the situations. But I mean, maybe it's just random racism and she's really unlucky. But I don't really think so. Like, somebody tried to kill her with a brick and somebody tried to kill her with a train. And parsimony suggests that these are the same person or the same force. Seems just like a kind of a basic way of how you read books, is you assume that things mean something and they're connected. So basically, maybe somebody's trying to stop her from fulfilling this fate that she's destined for with Roland, whatever that's going to be. I don't know. This is one of my more daring theories in that it's complicated and multi-part, and if it's wrong, then it'll be really funny to look back on. But
no, I think that's really cool. Yeah. I would say that it seems like if we look at the drawing of the Lady of Shadows card, it seems like the wheelchair and the of 2 persons is pretty key to that prediction. So
you could say they're trying to like make her rather than kill her.
Yeah.
You could almost say it either way. But the universe has contrived to cut her in two different ways with 2 different traumatic events. Okay. That's, or maybe it tried to kill her and accidentally made her. What do you think about that? Huh?
Interesting. Yeah. Very interesting. All right. So as Odetta tells Eddie about this is just like, this whole chapter, Matt, is just like this really, really nice conversation between Odetta and Eddie, as they're just like the topics range over multiple things. I mean, the core of the conversation is Eddie trying to convince Odetta that this place that she's in, this experience that she's having is real, but it ranges over many topics as they're both learning about each other. And as Odetta is telling Eddie about the work she's trying to do, she keeps referring to it as Oxford Town. He remembers this song that his brother Henry sang when he was just in diapers about Oxford Town, and it is actually a real song. The name of the song is Oxford Town by Bob Dylan. It was written in 1962 about the 1962 Old Miss riots. This was during desegregation, when the first black student went to attend Old Miss University, and then a bunch of bad people did not want that to happen because they were racist, and there was a big riot. 2 men were killed. And the thing that, like, Odetta keeps calling it Oxford Town. Like she did it back even before she met Eddie when she was talking with Andrew. And so in 1964, the song would have been out already. And so this seems like an event that is very important to her. I mean, Oxford is a place she decided to go for part of the Civil Rights Act struggle. And the way she says it is almost sing-songy. And this is another way in which Eddie and Odetta are connected.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? They're not just related to Roland, but they're connected to each other too.
Yeah. And it's like more than just like what are the odds that this is a song that like sticks in Eddie's mind because he remembers his brother Henry singing it over and over and over again. Like Henry is this important, all-powerful figure in Eddie's mind, and this was the song he happened to sing, and now this is the person in front of him, someone that is in that same fight for civil rights and was just in Oxford moments before she was drawn into this story.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like Henry has a history of saying sort of semi-prophetic things.
Sure.
That all scans. I like that a lot. Yeah. I mean, yeah, their interactions are so generally wholesome and hopeful that I just can't wait for Roland to just fuck everything up.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But yeah,
stop being so pessimistic, Matt.
But yeah, the book really has a lot of cultural references, doesn't it? Like enough to where you have to think it's intentional, because we've got references to Challenger explosion, TWA jet crash, Dylan's song about real historical riots. And I feel like it really is more than just like, it's in the 80s. He's going to reference stuff that happened in the 80s. Like if I wrote a book set in 2020, I really wouldn't feel compelled to like include random references to the COVID-19 virus or Andrew Yang unless it was like extraordinarily relevant, like to the plot. And
I don't know, the way this virus is going, Matt, maybe you would.
Yeah. I mean, if I was setting it in February of 2020, I wouldn't necessarily. But all that said, like I feel like there's a really large amount of like cultural references in this book, and I don't really know why. I don't really understand the intent. And I mean, maybe this is just a Stephen King thing, but like I've read a couple of his other books, and I don't remember there being this many references to historical moments.
Yeah.
I mean, like the best I can do is say maybe he's just trying to tie together these different times with like threads of fate by pointing out these kind of serendipitous details that are that relate these things to each other. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that feels right to me. I do think that absolutely some of it is just Stephen King being Stephen King. He likes cultural references. He's always liked cultural references. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot, and there is a lot kind of in rapid succession. And I do think this series is kind of an exploration of like connections in certain ways, and especially this book. Like all these characters are connected to each other in interesting ways. And I think using cultural references as connection points is an interesting method.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most useful thing I can think of there in terms of why is he doing this exactly.
Yeah. So Odetta and Eddie's conversations continue as they swap some pleasantries, including slurs of both the racist and homophobic kind. The 80s. Anyway, Eddie tries hard. He continues to try hard to convince Odetta that yes, this is real, and yes, this is finally happening. And he finally points to the jewelry all over her hands, which Odetta has just previously explained. She doesn't wear jewelry. She never wears jewelry. And then Eddie's like, well, you're wearing some right now. And she's like, oh, she explains it away. And then Eddie shouts out, you sound like a broken record. He was genuinely angry for the first time. Every time someone pokes a hole in your neat little story, you just retreat to that none of this is happening shit. You have to wise up, Detta. Don't call me that. I hate that. She burst out so shrilly that Eddie recoiled. I really like this moment because, like, we know that Odetta has this bullshit narrative she's building to create explanations for her moments of time lost. And this shows that she is maybe more conscious of Detta than she wants to admit.
Yeah. I wonder if she would have reacted this way before her little moment of becoming aware of Detta. Yeah. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. And I mean, like, I think one of the things we have to say is like, It's going to be really exciting when these two find out about each other.
Yeah.
And how they're going to react to that is going to be interesting. Like we spent a long time in this chapter really like this whole section has been really explaining who Odetta and Detta are. I think we've spent a little bit more time on Odetta, but I think that the Detta side is coming. And it's going to be really interesting seeing like the ways in which we can guess how they would interact with each other given the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I can't even imagine like they come like are they going to be talking in their shared head, or are they going to like be swapping back and forth in a Gollum fashion?
Yeah,
I'm excited to see if that is coming, how that manifests.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So their conversation basically ends with Eddie giving up because Odetta is just like totally adamant. She's like, "No, you're wrong. I'm done talking about it." And Eddie's just like throws his hands up and fine and walks away. And Roland happens to be coming back from his water trek. So this is, I mean, we didn't talk about that, Matt, but this is like really the first time in this story that we just haven't had Roland around. Like this is like a whole chapter where Roland just wasn't there because he saw the two of them bonding and talking, and he just said, "Okay, I'll go get the water," and he just leaves our story, and that's really never happened.
Yeah, and he's all like depressed because nobody likes him.
Yeah,
and he's incapable of love.
Yeah,
and he's off walking by himself, thinking very heavy cowboy thoughts. It's so sad. Poor Roland. Poor Roland.
Yeah, poor Roland. Poor Roland, especially because he's getting sick again. He didn't bat the cycle with the antibiotics, and the infection is returning and in a big way. And we know that door number 1 and number 2 are gone. They've both been drawn through, so he cannot go back through them. And so Roland's only hope to get help is gonna have to be door number 3.
Ah, man, this is how we get superbugs, Roland. And I don't mean the lobstrosities.
Or maybe it's like a time thing where the lobstrosities are the result of the superbugs that Roland made here by not batting for the cycle.
Yeah, they got through the portal when he opened the door, and now he's ruined the timeline. I love it.
Yeah. So this is kind of how our chapter ends, though. They know they've got the problem of Roland's infection returning, but they've got bigger problems. And Roland finally dishes what he figured out. Odetta and Detta have are 2 people inside 1 woman, and he says here to close the chapter, "The woman I entered on the other side of the door was as deadly as those lobster things that come out at night." And we know how deadly those are.
Yep. Oh man, King is so good at keeping the pace going.
Yeah, he really does. It's just like it's kind of relentless, but like I feel like these 3 chapters we got a lot of time to sit around. Like chapter 3 was almost entirely like sit, relax, and just chat. But then we got that chapter, and then he's like, "Okay, time for next conflict. Let's go."
Yeah, I want to talk about this from a meta perspective, because I talked about this at the top of the episode, how this book is just so fun and exciting and engrossing, without ever really going for what you might call like the easy storytelling options. I mean, the closest thing we've got to like a protagonist that we can relate to is a 21-year-old heroin addict. Roland is fascinating and relatable, but like also really a puzzle in many other ways. And the actual stakes of the story are just consistently kept frustratingly behind the curtain. So basically, overall, King has made this very difficult for himself, and yet it pains me to stop reading every week. I don't. I really kind of want to study this book and this series, because it's continually inventive and exciting and never really following a formula, and yet always entertaining and always engrossing. And I think that's really, really hard to do.
I agree. I mean, I think it's like I love that idea of he's making it hard for himself. It's like he's picked the most complex gymnastics routine where like you get the highest possible score if you pull it off, but it's also way harder to pull off. And he is like, so far, I think he has pulled this off. And I don't know, like I look at like, why do I like this book so much? What is the one thing about this book that makes me like it so much? And I mean, it's kind of cheating to say the characters, because of course it's the characters, but it is, I think the way it's more complicated than that. I think it's the way he writes the interaction between the characters. It's the life that he ingests in each character and how they interact with each other. Like we said, this chapter 3 that we've just spent almost 45 minutes on here is 2 people sitting in the sand talking about their lives. A lot of the stuff is stuff we already know because we know the secret of Odetta. King has told us about Odetta and Detta. He's explored that relationship for our perspective. Eddie doesn't know about it yet, but we do. So a lot of it's stuff we already know. A lot of it's stuff we already know about Eddie. But we're watching these two characters bond and come together. And like, I think the way in which the three and Roland end up coming together and bonding and interacting and challenging each other and fighting and like is going to be the core of this story, and we're kind of watching it unfold before our eyes here. So just like having these two amazingly drawn characters, and I keep using that word, and it's
funny. Yeah,
it's great.
We're primed on it, right?
Yeah. Just like watching them interact with each other and learn about each other and learn to love and respect and appreciate each other is just so enjoyable.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think frequently about the fact that I think we're all pretty primed to see hero's journey in things.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't know. It's just it's something that you and I have studied. We've actually kind of practiced seeing it in stories, and there's just not a hero's journey here. It's just, I mean, if there is, then it's on such a like large scale that we've only seen the very start of it, and it's going to be a very, very unusual hero's journey.
Sure. Yeah.
Or like we're starting in media res of a hero's journey, or there's going to be something. I mean, I'm inclined to just say like that's not what he's trying to do here. He's trying to do his own thing where he's just freestyling and doing and being crazy and weird, and I'm way more excited about this honestly than I would be if like we started this book and it was like Roland was a young man who had a challenge that he had. Like this is so much more fun to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think the thing that I love about it is I think these books are laid atop the bones of the hero's journey. Like they are still laid, like you have your hero, you have a quest at the end of this thing, like it's a grail quest, as you said. Like the hero's journey is here. It's just any time the hero's journey would zig, King zags. Consistently every time. I mean, like what we're doing here, what this book is doing is gathering Roland's fellowship, basically, right? Like that's what this book is doing. But instead of just like going to a town and for a chapter like explaining the quest and then having everyone join, instead what King does is write an entire book where we explore and draw, both in literally every meaning of that word, the characters. And that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's funny because as you say that, I'm like, well, yeah, I guess there is some hero's journey skeletal structure to it, but it's like Roland is just the worst protagonist for a hero's journey.
Yeah.
Because he's almost like hell-bent on not being a hero. He's like, I don't actually care about any of these people. I just want to get to the destination, which is a great perspective for a protagonist in a hero's journey, or I mean, great in the sense of being completely the wrong fit and thus going to result in some crazy situations.
Sure. The villain's journey.
Yeah, right. I hope so.
Yeah. All right, so that is the end of part 1 of part 2. This is confusing. That is the end of our section for this week. And so I think we've already talked about some of your speculations, right? Like, yeah. I think the big one you made was about Detta.
Yeah. I think I said something else in there somewhere that I've already forgotten. Sorry.
I think you also talked about that you thought that that the brick hitting Odetta and the subway were connected in some way by either the same person or same entity.
Same force. Yeah. The same something.
Yeah. So we'll keep track of those and see what we learn about those.
Yep. Cool.
But let's move on to our audience discussion from last week. Last week, the discussion question was compare and contrast Eddie and Jake. And we got a few really great answers here, Matt. So we'll start off with Sarah Penguin, who says, both Eddie and Jake love Roland. Jake sees him as the father figure, while Eddie compares him to his brother. Eddie's brother did take on the fatherly type role, so you can say Eddie also views Roland as a father figure, just in a different way from Jake. They both save Roland, Jake with the water as he is dying, and Eddie with antibiotics, food, and dealing with the lobsters. It took Jake a while to see Roland was willing to sacrifice him, while Eddie seems to pick up on it right away. Jake seemed to accept his fate and didn't fight it. So far, Eddie has shown he is scrappy, tenacious sort who keeps fighting when he is vulnerable. So either he will fight his way out of being sacrificed, or he will force Roland to make an active sacrifice rather than a passive one like Jake was. That is assuming Roland does try to sacrifice Eddie. I like that. Yeah, that's just a bunch of different ways in which they're definitely both very similar, but have some distinct differences.
You could almost view Eddie as like a more grown-up Jake in certain ways.
Yeah.
In that he has a similar core, but he's a little bit wily.
Yeah.
Megafire says, I just want to gush about how much extremely my shit of a character Eddie Dean is. A fast-talking, wisecracking young rogue with that hint of true steel, of a true spine when people least expect it out of him. It's exactly the kind of character I like to write myself, and it's so cool to see King take a spin at it. Eddie's a lot less willing to put up with Roland's bullshit than Jake was at the start, and seems to see straight through him. At the same, though, it looks like he's headed for the same trap as Jake. As you touched on, Eddie's an enabler at heart, first for his brother and now arguably for Roland, even with the clear resistance he's showing at first. He's older than Jake was and clearly more jaded than Jake was, and his view of Roland is a lot less naive, although he doesn't seem to be any less admiring of Roland than Jake was. It's an admiration that seems to come despite himself, the poor guy, and this also makes it clear that whatever Eddie brings to the table won't shake Roland from his path of sacrificing everything on the way to the tower either.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we talked last week about how, like, speculating on the ways in which this experience is going to change and alter Roland, but also the ways in which it's going to change and alter the people around him as well. And you wonder about what is those things that Eddie is going to bring to the table and how that will change Roland and how it will change himself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Finally, we have Namful, who says the obvious answer is the familial relationship between the two people that the familiar relationship the two have with Roland. Wow, I cannot talk. Jake saw Roland as a father figure, while Eddie has clearly been shown to view Roland as a brother. That agrees with what Sarah said. However, these two positions aren't necessarily as different as they may seem. So Namful's, taking the same thing. However, Eddie's relationship with his much older brother was almost like a father-son relationship. In Eddie's youth, Henry was his carer. By the end of Henry's life, Eddie was the carer. The role reversal is very similar to that of a parent growing older and needing to be cared for by their children. We are yet to see a relationship of Roland's in which he views the other person as an equal. Until that power dynamic changes, there will always be an element of carer-patient in his relationships. In Shuffle this week, Roland is forced into a position where he has to be cared for. Maybe this means he can eventually see Eddie as an equal. I like that a lot. That is something that I don't think we've ever stated, but Roland has always kind of had an upper hand in strength, in ability, and in knowledge over the people he's interacted with.
Yeah, that's true. He has this idea that like he's this badass gunslinger and everybody else is like these soft cattle who would die easily. And it's like it never really occurs to him that there are things that are worth being good at other than killing. At least we never see him consider it.
Yeah, well, he did this week. He's loving is worth being good at, and he's no good at it.
He's no good at it, and he wants to be good at it, and he can't be, so he just had a little depressing walk to go get some water. Yep.
Yeah, and now he's sick again, and so we're kind of seeing the book like swing back around to him being in a position where he is the cared for, not the carer. Again. Yeah. Only this time there's someone else here too.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, so this week's discussion question is, one of Odetta's defining characteristics is being part of the movement for civil rights for people of color. Why do you think King chose to explore this idea in this book? And how does that relate back to our protagonist? I've got some ideas on this one, but I really wanted to crowdsource this one, so I'm really curious what do you guys think about this?
Yeah, I'm curious as well.
All right, so that is it for us here at Kingslingers. We will be back next week to wrap up part 2, The Lady of Shadows, with chapters 4 and Reshuffle. So that's what we're doing next week.
Awesome. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at doofmedia.
Yeah, and remember, kingslingerspod@gmail is where you can answer the discussion question, or on YouTube, or on our Reddit thread. That's r/doofmedia. And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, come on, do it.
Yeah.
Come on. Do it or I'll shoot you with a gun. Slinger. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else you can listen to podcasts. You can also check all the shows we do over at our website. That's doofmedia.com. That's where you can see our monthly book club, where we do read other books besides Stephen King books every so often. Once a month, we read a new book and we do a live stream discussion over on our YouTube channel to talk about that book. This month, we are doing a book called Recursion by Blake Crouch. It came out, I think this was last year. So we'll be doing that this Friday at 9:30 p.m. Central Time. You can find all the details for that at our website, doofmedia.com/book club. I love doing that discussions, Matt. It's so fun to interact with our listeners directly like that. So if you are new to Doof Media, if you are new to what we do, come join us for those book clubs. They're a lot of fun.
Yeah, and if you like any of our shows and you want to support them, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. You can donate to us at the $1 level, and you'll get access to our exclusive Doof Media Discord server, where tons of people will be ready to talk to you all about their Dark Tower experiences.
Oh my God, it's been busy in the Kingslingers chat this week, Matt. I think a lot of our new readers are really, really loving the drawing of the three, and are especially this latest section. So it's a very lively chat right now. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, there's a lot of spoiler bars right now.
Yes, there are a ton of them. If you cannot afford to donate right now, that is, of course, okay. You can instead help us out by sharing this podcast with all your King-loving friends. We've been posting it on some of the subreddits. If you can continue sharing it with some other communities that we might not know about, or just randomly on your social media, whatever, do that. It helps us a bunch. And of course, you can always help us out by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. There's I don't know. This week's Spotlight review comes from BakeyBakes19, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Just do it. I'm an old school fan of these two knuckleheads through their parahumans analysis, but you don't have to be a long-term listener to enjoy Kingslingers. Have you heard about this whole Dark Tower thing for years but never got around to reading it? Or like me, have you read through the series multiple times but missed the wonder and awe it inspires? Whichever the case may be, Matt and Scott are right for you. This is only the first episode, but I trust that my friends at Doof Media will bring more insightful metaphors and analysis week after week." Thank you, Bakey Bakes. We really appreciate that. And by the time we got around to reading this, we were on episode number 7. So hopefully we haven't let you down.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. Appreciate the vote of confidence. That's really nice.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks everyone who takes the time to do that. If you've left a review and haven't heard it yet, we're getting around to it. Sorry, we only do one a week. So we'll get to you, we promise. All right, folks, that's it for us this week. We'll see you back here next week as we wrap up part 2 of The Drawing of the Three. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.
Get some fucking Dunkin' Donuts!